The hot sun weighs on their shoulders, sweat streams down their faces under heavy helmets. Boots sink into the dust of the road. Behind them, a 40-kilometer march with a load of almost 40 kilograms. And all this for the sake of, in a few hours, building a city. Yes, not a metaphor but a real fortified camp, with streets, walls, a ditch and towers. 4 hours, after a whole day of grueling marching. How did they manage this? And why precisely in this routine lay their greatest secret? Polybius wrote that the Romans established a camp with such precision as if they were building a city for eternal habitation. But this city was to disappear the very next morning, like a mirage in the dust of war. Every day, a new march, a new camp. Hundreds of identical ones meticulously measured by steps down to the last cubit. You hear dull thuds, iron against turf. This is not the sound of battle, this is the music of discipline. Before your eyes, thousands of men, moving as a single organism. They know, until the camp is built, there is no rest, no food, no sleep. Each of them carries not only weapons, but also tools, shovels, hoes, stakes, wooden rings for tents. These are not soldiers in the usual sense. These are engineers with swords. An army that could erect a fortress faster than the enemy could even approach. This daily ritual was called castra, a word from which the names of dozens of European cities would later derive. Manchester, Lancaster, Gloucester. Castra. This is not merely a camp. It is a symbol of Roman order embodied in earth and sweat. Imagine the horizon line, where the sun slowly sets behind the hills, and on the plain a ghost city begins to be born. Without stone, without lime, only from wood and sweat. Streets stretch out under the measured blows of shovels. The ditch fills with darkness. Campfires flare up in strictly designated places. Historians still debate what was more striking, the speed or the precision. Every camp was built according to one scheme, with the same meticulousness with which an architect draws a temple. First, a location was chosen, flat, not far from water, with a view in all directions. A legate was responsible for this procedure, the commander of the legion. His decision could mean life or death for thousands of people. After the location was chosen, at the signal of a trumpet, the legionaries set to work. The vanguard, antecursor, which means one who goes before, marked out the territory using measuring poles. Every section, from tent to street, had precise dimensions. Thus began the construction of a city that was to disappear by morning. Archaeologists have found traces of such camps from Britain to Syria, even squares of earth, imprints of campfires, traces of ditches and gates. Everywhere the same, as if the very earth remembered their steps. And when you look at these traces 2000 years later, you involuntarily ask yourself what compelled these people, tired, hungry, worn out by the road, to erect walls again and again every evening. What was stronger than fatigue, fear, discipline, or faith in Rome? But before understanding this, one must see what exactly they had to go into battle with against nature itself. A Roman legionary's day began not with dawn, but with a trumpet. A coarse metallic sound broke through sleep, and within minutes hundreds of men stood in formation, like a single mechanism. They carried not only a sword and shield, but an entire home. A legionary's equipment weighed almost 40 kilograms. Armor, helmet, 2 spears, a cooking pot, stakes for fortifications, 3 days' worth of food, tools, and wooden stakes for camp walls. Vegetius wrote, "A soldier who cannot dig is unworthy of a sword." The Romans believed a fortress is born from sweat, not from steel. These men called themselves Muli Mariani, Marius Mules. This was in honor of Consul Gaius Marius, who once ordered soldiers to carry their own burdens to make the army more mobile. And now, each legionary was not just a warrior, but a mobile fortress. Under the weight of the load, backs bent, but no one complained. A breath, a step. A breath, a step. 40 kilometers a day. This was not a march. It was a punishment by time. The road led through dust, rain, heat, swamps. And still, order was maintained. Ahead marched the scouts, exploratores, their eyes searching for water, shelter, the enemy. Behind them, a column in strict formation. A centurion with a vine staff in hand monitored every step. One word, and the staff descended upon the shoulder of anyone who fell out of rhythm. The fear of disgrace was stronger than fatigue. At the trumpet's signal, the column halted. Not rest, but time for selection. The legate, surrounded by tribunes and engineers, surveyed the terrain. Too much grass, it could burn. Too close to water, danger of flooding. Polybius noted that the Romans chose a location not for convenience, but for advantage. The decision was made instantly. Then a new command was sounded. Soldiers with tools emerged from the ranks. Fossores, the diggers. This word originated from the Latin fossa, a ditch. They began first, marking out the lines of the future camp. Everything depended on their precision. Where the gates would be, where the ditch would lie, where the standards would be placed. The standards, incidentally, didn't just adorn the camp, they were its heart. At their location, the Principia was built, the headquarters where the legion's symbols were kept and the legate's tent stood. One could say the camp grew around this sacred core, like a body around a heart. When the marking was complete, work began that made the earth tremble. A ditch was dug, about 1.5 meters deep and up to 3 meters wide. The earth was thrown inwards, creating a rampart onto which stakes were driven. This barrier was called the vallum. It was not built for beauty, it was meant to stop enemy cavalry. At night, sentries, vigiles, were posted on the rampart. Their task was not just guarding, but silence. During excavations in Germany, archaeologists found the remains of a camp built on this principle. Even after 2000 years, the lines of the ditches were so straight that they could be mistaken for a modern geometric grid. Everything measured to the cubit, to the step. The speed was astonishing. 10,000 men could erect a camp in less than 4 hours. Each knew his section, his step, his tool. No one wasted time talking. This was work where an error could cost a life. Centurions checked angles and distances, like engineers building a bridge. Quartermasters ensured that tents and wagons stood strictly in their designated squares. Everything submitted to a single rhythm, which the Romans called ordo, order. This order didn't just simplify life, it created a feeling as if the entire world could be ordered. When the legionary tents rose in rows, the camp came alive. In the center, a place for the headquarters and an altar to the gods. Nearby, a field kitchen where cauldrons steamed, the smells of campfires, oil and iron mingled in the air. The shouts of centurions boomed over the clang of shovels. Everything around, like a huge organism, where every cell knew its place. But even in this routine, there was a ritual of pride. When the rampart and ditch were finished, the first torch was planted at the camp entrance, a sign that the city was ready. This was their daily triumph, perhaps not in Rome, but for its sake. And in this mechanical precision, in this exhausting repetitiveness, something more than mere safety was born. The Romans created order where chaos reigned. Every camp was not just a temporary refuge, but an assertion of power, a symbol that Rome stood here, even if only for one night. But to understand how this order held under the pressure of fatigue and fear, one must see what happened when the sun dipped below the horizon and the camp began to live its nocturnal life. When the last ray of sun faded over the vallum wall, the legion plunged into the ritual of night. The air grew thick with campfire smoke, with the smell of boiling wine and oil. The wind ruffled the tent canvases, where soldiers laid down their weapons and unbuckled straps from their weary shoulders. They knew night was not rest, but part of their duty. For a camp is not a fortress until the sentries are posted, and it was on them that Rome's awakening tomorrow depended. Every evening the centurion appointed guards, vigiles. They were chosen not by rank but by endurance and attentiveness. Their first task was to take an oath of silence. In a night camp, sound could kill. As darkness fell, their figures dissolved between the ditch and the wall, like shadows. They carried torches, but tried not to raise them high, so as not to reveal the camp's location. Only a faint flicker of light picked out sharp spears and glints on helmets from the darkness. The Romans called the night shifts vigiliae, 4 watches, each lasting approximately 3 hours. The first began immediately after sunset, the last ended before dawn. When the trumpet announced the changing of the guard, the camp seemed to breathe. One wave of fatigue replaced another. Silence and the sound of footsteps were the only sounds. Polybius noted, "No people observe silence in camp as the Romans do." In the center of the camp, near the Principia, a single permanent campfire burned. Here were the legate, officers, and scribes. They cross-referenced scout reports and drew maps. It was here that the army's morning movement was decided. The firelight reflected on the bronze helmets of the tribunes, and on the table, wax tablets covered with fresh root lines. All that was sweat and pain for the soldier, for the command was simply the geometry of war. On the outskirts of the camp, in the rows of tents, another life began. Soldiers shared bread, dried meat, cheese. They boiled water with vinegar, a drink called posca. It quenched thirst and helped disinfect the water. A simple but indispensable remedy. They cleaned weapons, greased straps, mended shoes. Even rest was a duty. A legionary belonged to himself neither day nor night. Each tent, contubernium, served as a home for 8 men. These groups of 8 formed the basis of the entire army. They shared food, tools, burdens, and in the event of one's death, another quickly took their place. Their cohesion was astonishing. Modern historians compare the contubernium to a submarine crew, so close and absolute was their dependence on each other. When the camp quieted down, the hum of distant voices, the barking of dogs, the squeal of wagon axles could be heard. Sometimes distant shouts of barbarians, their echo stretching across the plain. But inside the camp, confidence reigned. Romans believed the ditch and rampart were not just a barrier, but a magical line between chaos and order. Beyond it, barbarians and darkness. Within, law and discipline. The legate walked the camp before sleep. He was accompanied by lictors, bodyguards with bundles of rods. They carried not fear, but order. If the legate found a sleeping sentry on duty, he was executed on the spot, without words, without trial. Polybius wrote that one mistake could cost the entire army its life. Thus fear transformed into an iron will. But there were other fears, internal ones. A soldier might fear not the enemy, but the morning march, the heat, illness, the loss of friends. Therefore, before sleep, many placed a hand on the ground, as if asking it for strength. The earth was their eternal ally and eternal enemy. Sometimes an alarm was raised in the night. A trumpet cut through the silence and the camp sprang to life, as if resurrected. Soldiers grabbed their weapons, lined up along the rampart, torches flared along the perimeter. The enemy might not even be seen, a false alarm, animal noises or an accidental fire. But no one dared not to rise. This order saved the legions. By dawn, the camp came alive again. At the trumpet's signal, the vigiles handed over their weapons and the morning inspection began. Tents were folded, equipment was put away, traces were smoothed over. By midday, nothing remained of the camp but scorched earth and even lines of tracks. Where a city had stood at night, now lay a wilderness again. And yet, every such camp left a trace, not only in the earth, but in the people. They learned to build order from chaos, to survive amidst fatigue and fear. And when, after hundreds of such nights, they went into battle, the enemy faced not just an army, but a machine, where every man knew the value of stone, earth, and time. But how exactly the Romans turned this order into a weapon, and what happened when a camp had to be built under threat of attack? That's where the true essence of their genius was revealed. When smoke rose ahead, a sign of enemy presence, the camp was built not in calm, but on the verge of panic. But the Romans did not know this word. Everything transformed into a cold order, honed into instinct. Every legionary knew, the faster you raise the walls, the higher the chance of survival. On such evenings, the legate gave the command castra munire sub hoste, to build a camp under the enemy. These words meant do everything twice as fast, twice as precisely, twice as quietly. The march ended amidst the cries of ravens and the clank of metal. Dust rose in a column as centurions marked out the boundaries of the future camp. First came the metatores, the surveyors. Their task was to determine the location for the praetorium, the commander's tent, and to draw the axis of the streets. From here, lines radiated out, like the blood vessels of a new organism. Standards were placed at these spots so the entire legion could see. Rome was already here. The term the Romans used for this entire procedure was munitio. It simultaneously meant fortification, construction, and defense. It combined physical labor and the idea of impregnability. Munitio was an act of asserting power at any point in the world. Even if enemies were all around and the forest darkened, the camp had to be as straight as on the Campus Martius. When the enemy was close, not one ditch was dug, but two. Between them, a palisade of stakes was erected, tied with vine to prevent wobbling. Each legionary carried 3 such stakes on his back, tied with a strap. From a distance, a Roman column looked like a moving forest. Caesar wrote in commentaries on the Gallic War, "The Romans spring from the earth faster than the shadow of a spear." While one part of the army built fortifications, another occupied the outer line of defense. Guard manipules knelt, shields in the ground, eyes on the plain. Because of this system of shifts and guard duty, the camp could be built even under threat of attack. Everyone knew their place in a scheme that could be drawn even with closed eyes. Inside the vallum, a fever of organization began. A centurion with a measuring rod checked the straightness of the streets. Sappers dug holes for tent poles, and officers, servants, calones, dragged wagons with supplies and pegs. Everything ran like clockwork. No one could afford to be late. For that, they were beaten with a rod. Discipline in the camp was harsher than in battle. The legate usually stood on a raised platform observing the progress of the work. His tent was erected last, when everything else was ready. This rule reminded them, the commander rests only when his subordinates are protected. Even under the most critical conditions, it was not violated. When the earth trembled from the enemy's steps, the trumpets did not fall silent. On the contrary, the sounds intensified as if issuing a challenge. Musicians, tubicins, gave signals for the completion of stages. The ditch is ready, the rampart is raised, the gates are installed. Each sound meant that the camp was alive, and fear retreated. Special attention was paid to the gates. There were 4 of them, corresponding to the cardinal directions. The main one, Porta Praetoria, faced the enemy. Through it, the legion marched out at dawn. The opposite one, Porta Decumana, served as an emergency exit and symbolized the way home. For the Romans, even in a field camp, everything had meaning. Every street, every shadow. When the fortifications were completed, a rhythmic hammering could be heard from within. Wooden towers for observers were erected. They were built on the rampart to see further. Historians have found traces of such towers, charred remains of wood built strictly at the corners of the camp. Their geometric precision confirms everything was done not by eye, but according to a pre-calculated standard. In the evening, when the trumpets announced the completion of the work, the soldiers dropped to the ground right by the rampart. Faces covered in dust, hands trembling from fatigue, but eyes burning. Because beyond one wall lay darkness and death, and beyond the other, order and Rome. This contrast was felt by every cell of the body. Modern military engineers compare a Roman camp to a 21st century mobile base. Autonomous, modular, standardized, only instead of machinery, people. Each of them was a living brick of this structure. Sometimes the enemy tried to attack during construction. Then tools were exchanged for weapons, a shovel for a sword. But even in battle the formation did not break. Legionaries reformed into a defensive line, covering those who continued to dig. They fought not only for life, but for the very possibility of finishing the camp, because without it there was no future day. And when darkness fell, and the last torch was placed at the gates, the legate could say only one thing: Rome stands. These words required no confirmation. The camp itself was proof. But the next morning, when the trumpets called for the march, this city disappeared. Only footprints, a square ditch, and the smell of campfires remained. And everything began again. Another 40 kilometers, another night, another city of sweat and earth. To understand how a force capable of conquering continents was born from this endless cycle, one must see the moment when the camp ceased to be merely a refuge and transformed into a weapon. When the enemy approached closely, the camp ceased to be merely a night's lodging. It transformed into a living fortress, sharp-toothed, breathing, ready to strike. And in this lay all Roman genius. They didn't just build shelter, they created a strategic machine. Castra became a weapon, and this weapon operated without swords. In the first minutes of alarm, legionaries rose without commands. Everything was preordained, brought to automatism. They knew where their section of the wall was, where the centurion commanded, where the reserve weapons and water were. Psychologically, the camp was already their body. Its boundaries felt like their own skin. Even recruits, seeing how experienced soldiers acted without hesitation, fell into this rhythm. Caesar wrote, "The speed of erecting fortifications decided the outcome of battle more often than steel." When barbarians tried to attack the Romans during camp construction, they encountered not chaos, but rhythm. Diggers transformed into spearmen, guards into archers, baggage handlers into bearers of stones for throwing. The camp compressed into a testudo, a battle formation where shields interlocked overhead, forming a bronze shell. Testudo, the Latin word for tortoise. Under this shell, soldiers could move even under a hail of arrows, as if the very earth had risen to protect them. And when the attack subsided, within minutes the camp returned to construction, as if nothing had happened. Discipline was so strong that time seemed to obey their will. Historians have found traces of battles where the camp was erected parallel to the fight. Part of the legion held the defense, part continued to dig. This rhythm, life and war, labor and death, merged into a single breath. A special role in this process belonged to the centurions. These veterans knew that one mistake and the formation would collapse. They walked along the line of the rampart, monitoring every movement. In their hands was the vitis, a vine staff, a symbol of authority. But they rarely had to use it to strike. A glance was enough. Their presence reminded the soldiers that order was sacred, and panic was a crime. Every camp had its ritual of defense. Additional guards, custodes portarum, were posted at the gates. They were responsible for ensuring that in case of attack, no one broke in without command. If the enemy breached the first line of the ditch, the gates slammed shut, and the fight moved to the ramparts. There stood ballistae, Roman siege engines capable of launching arrows 2 meters long. But the camp's main weapon was not mechanical, it was order. Any army in the world could lose formation during a night attack. The Romans? No. They operated according to a pre-approved system of signals. The sound of a trumpet meant direction, the light of a torch, action. Not a single shout, not a single confusion. Everything through a sign. Soldiers said that the sound of the trumpet replaced fear for them, for if the trumpet sounds, it means Rome lives. And wherever they were, in the mountains of Spain, in the sands of Syria, or in the swamps of Germany, this sound united them into one whole. Archaeologists found the camp from the time of Augustus in Germany, in a place where an attack by the Cherusci was expected. The layers of earth show the ditch was dug a meter deeper than usual, the palisade was double-rowed, and between the ramparts were even imprints of torches. All this speaks of a night alarm, of tension, but there are no traces of panic, no scattered weapons, no broken walls, only order, as if even the threat of death did not break the formation. After repelling an attack, everything returned to the usual rhythm. Soldiers again pitched tents, mended tools, ate, slept. No heroism, no grand words, just the performance of duty. They did not build the camp for glory, they did it for the continuation of the march. This rhythm created the strength that conquered the world. When Caesar's army marched through Gaul, it could erect a camp even on a hillside, even in the rain, even in the snow. Modern researchers have calculated over 20 years of campaigns, such legions built more than 500 camps. Each according to one scheme, each like a new imprint of the same Rome. And if you think about it, this was not just an engineering feat, it was a statement. Order is stronger than fear. Time is an ally of discipline. Where others built temples, Romans built camps. For them, every rampart and ditch was an act of faith. In Rome, in law, in the human being capable of creating order even in hell. But this feat had a price. Behind it lay blood, fatigue, and endless kilometers of travel. And when it all ended, when the last camp was left behind, the moment began for which these people endured, suffered, and moved forward. The moment when they understood, Rome is not walls, not gold, not emperors. Rome is their sweat, and the earth beneath their feet. When dawn painted the sky above the camp, the trumpets sounded again. This sound was not just a signal, it was a rebirth. Soldiers rose, folded tents, leveled the ground. Everything that had seemed like a city at night disappeared within hours. It was as if the camp dissolved into the morning air, leaving only a trace, a perfect rectangle, an imprint in the earth. The Romans left nothing superfluous. Even the ashes from campfires were buried so that the enemy could not use them for divination. For them, departure meant not flight, but the completion of a ritual. When the last stake was pulled from the ground, the legion was already ready to move. The journey began with a new trumpet signal, and the procession once again transformed into a river of people, carrying Rome further. The view from afar was astonishing. Thousands of people moved like a mechanism, not a single random step. Everyone knew where they were going and why. This was not an army in the usual sense, it was a civilization on the march. Wherever a legionary's foot trod, order began. And if at light the camp was a fortress, then in the morning it became a promise. A promise that wherever they stopped tomorrow, the earth would once again take the form of Rome. This was the secret of their strength, not in iron, but in repetition. The belief that any place could be turned into a home if the ritual was observed. Thus Rome moved forward, day after day, camp after camp, and even when the empire fell, this rhythm long echoed in the heart of Europe. In straight streets, in fortresses, in cities that grew up on the sites of those very camps. Rome departed, but its camps never truly disappeared.